Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this webinar about the Indiana Energy Independence Fund. My name is Genevieve Zilmer. I am the Community Resilience Outreach Coordinator at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. Here, part of my role is with the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub, which is a collaboration between ERI and the Center for Rural Engagement here at Indiana University. The Funding Hub helps rural communities obtain federal grant funding for climate, energy, and resilience-related projects. This is our 7th webinar in the Funding Indiana Resilience series, and this webinar will be recorded. This webinar and our previous webinars are available on the ERI website. We will also share resources about the Funding Hub and an intake form to connect with the team in the chat. For today's webinar, we will hear from Alex Crowley, the Executive Director of the Indiana Energy Independence Fund. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you have a question, you can add it to the chat throughout the presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and especially thank you to Alex Crowley. Please take it away.
Thanks, Genevieve. It's great to have so many people on the webinar and so many people interested in the work of the Indiana Energy Independence Fund. By the way, I'm going to refer to the Indiana Energy Independence Fund as IEIF today because it's a mouthful. So IEIF, everybody commit that to memory. I'm Alex Crowley. I'm the executive director, I should say. And in fact, I'm the inaugural executive director. I've been at this for about 7 months, and it's been a very exciting time so far. We're just getting started. Before I launch into the agenda, I wanted to thank Bill and Genevieve from ERI's Indiana Resilience Funding Hub for allowing me to talk about IEIF today, and also thank the broader ERI team for their tireless efforts supporting cities and towns and nonprofits, and really all of us across the state of Indiana. ERI is a great partner. And as Genevieve mentioned, if you haven't done so recently, I would really encourage you to revisit their website, especially those previous webinars. They're really great resources as we're trying to wrap our brains around this once-in-a-lifetime federal funding opportunity. I'd also like to thank all of IEIF supporters, which include the amazing McKinney Family Foundation, which is an Indiana leader in environmental sustainability efforts, and really a force of a lot of the good that's happening across the state. I want to thank the City of Indianapolis Office of Sustainability, who have been tremendous partners. They actually helped to form IEIF and are helping me connect throughout the state. And there are so many other supporters. I've listed some of them at the end of the presentation. I want to acknowledge them, also acknowledge all the organizations represented here and across the state who are working on clean energy and the clean energy transition. You all do amazing work. I'm really thrilled to be learning a lot about you during this ramp-up period, and thank you now and for the future partnership that you all represent. So if you can go to the next slide. There we go. You'll see today's agenda will be as follows, and I'm hoping to get through it in about 40 minutes to leave some time at the end for questions. I'll start with an overview of green banks generally, and then specifically IEIF. I'll summarize the why of green banks, which, spoiler alert, is among other things to fill financial gaps in the financial market. I'll share some examples of other green banks, both next door in Michigan and across the country in Connecticut, to help you better understand what it looks like when a green bank is making major statewide impacts, both in residential and commercial activities. I'll provide an overview of the most significant federal funding opportunities in front of us, which is timely because word on the street is that some may be announced as early as next week, if you believe those rumors. And then I'll touch on next steps before turning it over to questions. And as Genevieve says, I think, post your questions. If there's anything that needs to be clarified in the course of the presentation, I'm happy to have that interruption and do it then. Otherwise, we can tackle some of the questions at the end. So buckle up. It's going to be an interesting 40 minutes, and let's get going. If you go to the next slide. Let me start with my contact information so you have it up front. I also have it listed at the end of the presentation. I encourage anyone really to reach out, even if you have a project that's just a twinkle in your eye right now. As you'll see here, I spent a number of years at the city of Bloomington as the director of economic sustainable development. So I know cities, I know how they work, I know how resource constrained they can be. And I also bring a fairly significant amount of nonprofit and private sector experience, both in large organizations, smaller organizations, even startups, and and I have some experience in business operations and general management, all of which might be useful to any of you who are trying to scope out projects. So the bottom line is, don't hesitate to contact me by email or by phone or by text or by carrier pigeon. I'm here to help. And if I can't help, then I'll find someone who can. Next slide. So what's a green bank? My guess is you've probably heard the term, so maybe I can add a little something to your understanding. A green bank, at its core, facilitates private investment into domestic, low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure. So let me unpack that a bit. There are really three elements in the statement that I want to highlight. First, what does it mean by facilitating private investment? So a green bank is not a licensed lending institution per se. It works with lenders and uses its funds to create leverage. It pursues and accepts funding from public, philanthropic, and private sources, and then leverages that funding to activate private capital to reach projects and populations that private capital doesn't or won't naturally reach. This can be done by de-risking investments through loan loss reserves and other credit enhancements. So in other words, green banks take on the risk that private capital doesn't like, which lets the lenders, in other words, the private capital, extend financing terms to individuals or entities that fall outside the private capital's normal rules and restrictions. I should also note that green banks typically don't provide grants, although it can work alongside grants and can help stimulate grants. So when I say financing or investment here, that actually means financing. Second, the word domestic. So domestic highlights that a green bank typically operates in a fixed geographic footprint, in our case, the state of Indiana. The term domestic also echoes some requirements in the Inflation Reduction Act that encourage and incentivize the use of domestically manufactured equipment. So that's an additionally important aspect of all of this. And low carbon resilient infrastructure highlights the mission of green banks to focus on a key issue, which is the clean energy transition. So green bank financing has a very specific subset of investment types. So if you're here trying to finance your backyard pool, unfortunately, you're out of luck. So this brings us to the second bullet. A green bank will focus on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure. So people think, green banks only operate in renewable energy, which is, of course, critically important, but green banks also support energy efficiency projects, which I'll detail later, and importantly, also include things like electric school buses and fleet electrification, and also EV infrastructure. The third bullet points to the fact that green banks work across nearly every sector, from single-family homes to multifamily residential, commercial, industrial, nonprofit facilities, and local government operations. And the final bullet speaks to the different types of green banks out there in the US and the world. So let me just explain that. A green bank can take one of three forms. The first is where a state or a local government stands up a green bank and operates it from within the governmental apparatus. The second is where a state or local government funds a green bank, but sets it up as a quasi-governmental agency or entity. In Indiana, we actually have the third type, which is the nonprofit model, untethered from state government, but supporting the state's efforts wherever and whenever possible. This provides the green bank greater flexibility and allows it to operate independent of the whims of the legislature. So given Indiana's sometimes complicated legislative environment, a nonprofit model made the most sense here in Indiana. Nearly every state is a green bank, and one of the various types outlined above. And we're in great company, and we're really collaborating a lot with green banks, especially during this period, because we're all really working on the same mission. Next slide, please. So why? Why do green banks exist? In other words, what are they trying to accomplish, and what are their goals? Key to understanding the roles of green banks is to understand that they are mission-driven organizations focusing on helping underserved communities improve their savings, safety, and health through cheaper and more reliable sources of energy. Let me emphasize underserved communities. The basic issue is this, which is that the broad financial market does a reasonably good job of supporting investments, even in clean energy, if you're a homeowner or a business with assets, or if you have a good FICO score and you generate robust income. But the problem is that the very people and organizations who are most susceptible to the negative impacts of our state's legacy of unclean energy are the ones least able to improve the situations. And so that can affect either their energy burden, meaning what they pay for energy relative to their income, the safety of their structures, and ultimately the negative health impacts that stem from this historical and unfortunately ongoing structural challenge. So green bank financing helps to lower energy costs by stimulating the adoption of clean energy alternatives, especially for communities that have been left behind. And the way the green banks do this is to use their own capital to remove perceived risks that may be hindering private capital from reaching harder to reach people or businesses. And I emphasize perceived risks because often what's holding up the private capital is mostly rules that may not actually reflect an individual or business's ability to repay loans. More broadly, green banks are working to transform the green technology marketplace by stimulating demand, which leads to community development and job creation and a more long-lasting and robust transformation. All the while, green banks are focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions with maximum efficiency and impact. Next slide, please. So the inability of certain populations to access reasonably priced financing, or any financing for that matter, translates into very significant disparities in the lives of underserved communities. I found this graphic about national data at the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, and it's frankly pretty devastating. I'll go across the top and then the middle and the bottom. 31% of households have trouble affording their energy bills. Of these, 50% are Black households and 40% are Latinx households. So think about that. 50% are Black households, 40% are Latinx households. Only 7% of the world's low-income households have access to clean energy. In a low-income area, a study found it was twice as expensive to upgrade to energy-efficient light bulbs than in wealthier areas, which has to do with availability and costs. And just think about the unfairness that suggests. And then at the bottom, Black people are more likely to be exposed to air pollution than the general public, which leads directly to serious health issues. And Black people are 3 times more likely to die from asthma due to poor air quality than white people. This is very devastating, and I would encourage you to read some of the underlying studies associated with this graphic. The sources, as you'll see here, are listed under each section, and you can Google them, which is what I did. So if you go to the next page. So this narrows the focus to Indiana, and it's no surprise Hoosier households have similar issues. And I'm only highlighting here the energy burden subset, but I do encourage you to go to the Energy Justice Lab, which is a collaboration of IU and I think UPenn, which has a lot of information. 15% of Hoosier households can't pay their energy bill. 30% had to choose between energy costs and buying food or medicine. 30% of households couldn't pay at least one energy bill in 2021. And what you'll see on the right here is a graphic from the IU Public Policy Institute, where the energy burdens are worse in Indiana, and this is from 2022. Go to the next page. So hopefully everyone here understands, there's a major structural challenge in the country and in Indiana, where underserved communities are being left behind in the clean energy transition. They're suffering disproportionately from it, both economically, from a health perspective, and a quality of life perspective, and things need to change. And IEIF is only a small part of that change. But because a lot of this inequality comes down to money, we're hoping that we can help to address one of the core problems. As I've touched on already, we're Indiana's newly formed green bank, having launched last year. The fund was seeded by philanthropic entities, both from within Indiana and also across the Midwest, which is interesting. A number of outside parties are particularly interested in seeing Indiana accelerate its clean energy transition as part of the broader Midwest push. So we are actually benefiting from that interest. The fund is serving statewide across Indiana, and that means both urban and rural parts of the state. We participated in 9 different greenhouse gas reduction fund applications, and we're trying to position the state to maximize its benefits from this once-in-a-lifetime federal clean energy investment. I'll get into that a little bit later in the webinar. And as I mentioned before, IEIF is a nonprofit green bank, meaning we don't rely on state funding, although we're definitely open to it in the future. And then we're getting ready to launch our residential and commercial financing in 2024 this year. In fact, hopefully by mid-year. And by commercial here, I should explain that that's a broad term meaning multifamily, housing, business, municipal, educational, institutional, et cetera. Next page. So while we're certainly focused on financing as a core component of IEIF's mission, especially for disadvantaged communities across the state, we also fill other gaps. So we're collaborating with resources from outside the state, and we're going to be bringing many of those resources into the state of Indiana to help on local projects. There are also a number of funding opportunities out there, as you know, and those can be overwhelming. A role that IEIF can play is to help rationalize those sources. So you may know the term capital stack, to make projects as possible, financially possible. What we're trying to do is leverage every possible resource available, and we're not trying to displace some of these other resources. We're really just trying to sort of step in and fill gaps that might exist once those other resources are being used. So those can include tax credits and rebates, grants, other financing options. And so we can help to sort of build those capital stacks as needed. Because IEIF is statewide, we're also getting a lot of visibility as to what the needs are across the state, the common needs in various parts of the state. And so, we can help in certain ways to standardize some of those efforts, which can speed up implementation. We can help to relieve local resources from having to reinvent processes that perhaps a different part of the state's already implementing. And then we also have the ability to help, as ERI does and others, in sharing best-in-class practices from one part of the state to the other. And as I mentioned, we're bringing in ideas from outside the state. We're constantly hearing from our counterparts and other green banks about ideas that could work here too, and we evaluate those, and hopefully we can bring those in as well. And then there are a number of statewide partners that we are working with and hopefully are aligning with. And so we're really part of a collaborative effort and network to help individuals and local players. Next slide. So I've given you a fair amount of information so far. Let me focus on some additional details, which help to explain this further. So what are eligible green bank projects, you might ask? As I said, some people think it may be limited to renewable energy, but it's not. Those are certainly eligible and really important as part of the work that we're going to do in Indiana. I just saw an article the other way, by the way, that was talking about how much solar had been installed in 2023, and it was pointing to the fact that most of the solar was installed by utilities, with somewhat anemic residential, commercial, and community solar, and we definitely need to tip the scales in the other direction on that. But in addition to renewable energy efficient upgrades, starting with audits and including HVAC and lighting and insulation and other weatherization. All of that is part of the work. And I also just realized this should include the alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure. So that's the kind of package of activities that a green bank gets involved in. Next slide. So you may be wondering, how does this all literally work? Like, how does a loan recipient, a household or a business or a nonprofit, how do they learn about, access, and implement green bank financing to accomplish whatever project they have, whether it's energy efficiency or renewable energy? So the answer is that there are basically two intermediary players that a green bank work with. On the one hand, you have lenders, and on the other hand, you have contractors. So as I noted earlier, IEIF itself is not a lending institution. It works with lending institutions, and it helps to catalyze private capital. So we're starting to build up a statewide network of lending partners that will collaborate with us to provide the financing. At the same time, if you're Mrs. Smith and you're sitting at your kitchen table and you're trying to figure out how to make your home maybe more energy efficient, or if you want to add solar panels, nobody expects Mrs. Smith to know about or to have to find IEIF. Mrs. Smith will be talking to her HVAC contractor or solar installer, and they will be the ones that provide financing options associated with the upgrade. And so at the same time that we're building up lender networks across the state, we're building up a contractor and installer trade ally network. So these are contractors that will be fully vetted by us and participating in the clean energy financing program. We're particularly interested in working with contractors that have been underserved or under-resourced by the traditional financial market, and especially are seeking out minority-owned and women-owned contractors and installers. So these two players, the lenders and the contractors, will be working off the same technology platform, which will create streamlined job reviews, loan approvals, and then ultimately support the quick implementation of the projects, whether at homes or in businesses. So the advantage of bringing in national platforms to Indiana, which we're doing because we're really trying to move as quickly as possible, is that the kind of technology, the technology platform that this is going to be built on is actually already built. And it's being used in other states. And we're basically effectively leveraging the technology and the processes that exist already and have been proven out, but also the expertise of the partners that are going to be coming in to help us make this happen in Indiana. Next slide. So I mentioned that IEIF will work across a whole list of sectors. You'll see those here. There's single family, multifamily, residential. You have small and mid-sized businesses. You have the industrial sector, nonprofits, the educational sector, local government. It's really the whole pie, and green banks operate across all of them. Next slide. So I'm going to show you just very quickly some green banks in action. I'll start with Michigan Saves, which is the oldest nonprofit green bank in the country. And they've been at this for about 15 years or so. They're really knocking it out of the park up in Michigan. And they represent basically what we want to be as soon as possible. So, I'll just touch on some of the stuff here. I do encourage you to go visit their website and dig into some of the details. You'll note at the top, they're working in residential and commercial writ large, and they also have a feature on the upper right-hand corner of their site where someone can find a vetted contractor. We'll have the same functionality here in Indiana. Go to the next slide. Their site details out eligible home improvements and provides significant details and options for all of the projects. You'll see, here that includes roofing and windows and solar and a whole bunch of other investments. Go to the next slide. Keeps going into the basement. It has, water heaters, HVAC upgrades, and then out in the garage, they're showing battery storage projects and EV charging. So it's a pretty broad swath of projects, and this is just their work with residential, but you'll get a feel for the kinds of projects that qualify. Go to the next slide. This is another example. This is the Connecticut Green Bank. Where Michigan Saves is the oldest nonprofit green bank, Connecticut actually has the oldest green bank. So of all the green banks, I think not by much, but they've also been at it for about, my guess, about 15 years. You'll see their website shows basically the same approach as with Michigan Saves. So you have home solutions and you have building solutions. And if you go to the next slide. They have tools in Connecticut that we unfortunately don't yet have here, like the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy or CPACE program. But there are groups in Indiana trying to make that happen here. But other options exist for businesses. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see they have a portfolio of solar programs, multifamily solutions, energy solar storage solutions. So, like with Michigan Saves, they have a very broad swath of project types, in this case in commercial. And, I should clarify and reiterate that while I'm just highlighting Connecticut's commercial work here, they have a very active residential program set as well. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so if you're still hanging in there with me, and thank you if you are, this is the last kind of section of the presentation where I want to summarize some of the federal and other funding coming down the pike that's going to help us in 2024 and beyond with our clean energy work. So I mentioned earlier that IEIF had been actively involved in positioning Indiana to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund competitions. And you may know that there are three. All three are designed to be transformative to the clean energy economy and are designed to build up institutions, including green banks, so that this initial outlay of funding, significant as it may be, can last well into the future. You may remember in 2008, there was major federal funding, and it was directed to what they were calling shovel-ready projects. One of the problems with that funding was that once it had been issued, that was kind of it. The work dried up, the money dried up, and a whole infrastructure of people and of jobs that had been activated were effectively stranded once the money was gone. And the Biden administration, I think, is specifically designing these programs to avoid repeating that same problem. And, I should also mention that word on the street, and I've mentioned this before, the first two buckets on the left may be awarded as soon as next week, which makes this webinar particularly timely. So let me summarize the three components of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The largest is a $14 billion bucket of funding called the National Clean Investment Fund, or NCIF. This will be allocated to 2 to 3 national nonprofits, and those nonprofits will make direct investments into qualified projects using a number of financial tools. So the purpose of the NCIF, as opposed to the next bucket, the CCIA, is to cover major projects that extend beyond the jurisdictions or capabilities of any local players like IEIF. So you can think of major utility scale wind or solar projects, or projects that cross state lines like national retailers or national fleets. Now, the second bucket is the $6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, or CCIA. And this will be issued to 2 to 7 hub nonprofits. But instead of these hubs directly investing, as in the case of the NCIF, most of this money will actually be passed through to community lenders like green banks and CDFIs and others. And those community lenders will then engage in lending for qualified projects at businesses or nonprofits or local government, and also, help support residential lending programs. So, in the case of CCIA, the funding will help to catalyze and boost the balance sheet of community lenders. And interestingly, this funding includes technical assistance funding, so training, staff development, communications, workforce development, among other uses. And CCIA also requires that 100% of the funding be directed toward low-income and disadvantaged communities. The third bucket is called Solar for All, and that represents $7 billion in total. That may be announced a little bit later than the first two. And this last bucket, Solar for All, is focused on low-income residential solar, and can include grants and financing and rebates and other tools. And I'll get to this program for Indiana here in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So just to show you the complexity of the competition for NCIF and CCIA, found this cool graphic from Third Coast Strategies showing you which groups applied for which portions of the competition. So you'll see that some applied for one or the other, some applied for both. What I would encourage you to do is familiarize yourself with the names of these organizations, especially when the awards are announced, because some of them are going to suddenly be flush with cash and looking to move it out quickly. Go to the next slide. So I touched on Solar for All. I just want to highlight that Indiana actually was included in 3 different Solar for All applications. 2 of them, the ones on the left, effectively were competing with each other. And I think each was for about $250 million. And a third, the one on the right, was from a kind of a separate pool of funding. So it didn't really compete with the other 2. But it did touch on a couple of major cities here in the state. So on the left, one was completed by IHCDA, and that's, I think of that as kind of the official state of Indiana application. It included significant multifamily housing support and also single-family housing, I should say, clean energy, solar work for significant for multifamily and single-family, and had some community solar in it as well. The other statewide application was led by Inca and was submitted on behalf of a coalition of statewide and local nonprofits. And the mix of the application was pretty different, actually, from IHCDA, and was also a very strong application. I'm very interested to see how the Environmental Protection Agency, which is administering this competition and the funding, will score these 2 and judge them against each other, and what the outcome will be of having had 2 statewide applications submitted. And then to the right, you'll see Fort Wayne and Indianapolis were included in a coalition of cities called the Industrial Heartland Solar Coalition. And that stretched from Buffalo to Kansas City and down to West Virginia and St. Louis. And, that was, as I mentioned before, a separate application as part of a coalition bucket. What remains to be seen, frankly, is if this is awarded, this coalition application is awarded, how will the EPA consider any overlap that may touch Fort Wayne and Indianapolis between all of these? So some questions certainly remain. I think this will be announced a bit later on, potentially than the first 2 buckets of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Go to the next page. There are several additional funding efforts underway. One is the Climate pollution reduction grant process, which is being led by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. This funding is very flexible, and so it can be used to fill in where other buckets aren't touching. You'll see here that there were some early non-competitive awards to each applying state to develop climate pollution reduction plans. And then there's the $4.6 billion in total, which presumably Indiana will seek some sort of proportionate amount. These are competitive grants, and they're designed to implement the plans that are developed from the first bucket. Next slide. Another set of programs making their way through are the residential rebate programs being led by the Indiana Office of Energy Development. So these are Department of Energy programs, and they include funding to support two statewide initiatives, the Home Electrification and Appliance Rebates Program and the Home Efficiency Rebates Program. So in the first case, the programs will provide point-of-sale discounts to consumers for purchases of qualifying high efficiency, or I should say, high efficiency electric appliances and other energy efficiency products. And they'll be available to households, I think, whose income is below 150% of the AMI. And in the second case, the funding will provide savings-based incentives for whole home efficiency upgrades and retrofits, and rebates will scale up as income levels decrease. So as I said, the Office of Energy Development is currently building its plans for these programs, and we expect them to materialize here in the not too distant future. Next slide. The last program I want to highlight is a really important one. And if I'm not mistaken, there's actually a whole webinar on this on ERI's site, which I would encourage you to go see. I think of this as maybe the IRA's best kept secret. It's referred to as direct pay, and it is designed really to close a hole in the IRS's rules regarding clean energy tax credits. So let me try to explain quickly using this graphic, which was from the Rocky Mountain Institute, sort of before and after of direct pay. So before direct pay, an entity effectively had to have a tax liability to leverage a tax credit. And if it didn't, and nonprofits, including local governments, don't, then either it had to just outright forego the tax benefit or twist itself into a convoluted agreement of some sort to gain the benefits through someone that did have a liability. So an entity would have to, sometimes have complicated financing agreements with private companies that were serving as intermediaries, and those would be the ones that had the liabilities and therefore could take the credits. That was complicated. It put nonprofits at a disadvantage, and also, sometimes they had to forego those outright. To the right is what this looks like after the direct pay provision was added as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So now a nonprofit with a qualifying project can receive the tax credit basically as a direct payment, so cash in hand, to ultimately offset and therefore reduce project costs. So that's huge. That's a really big difference before and after. It's still a complicated process. I mean, in part, you're dealing with the IRA, and that just makes it complicated. I should say the IRS. But also there's a delay between when the project is being built and when the reimbursement occurs, but certainly much simpler than before. The other thing is it's not a capped funding pool, like the other buckets I was describing before. This is uncapped, at least for the time being. And so, if you're a nonprofit or a local government or another tax-exempt organization, strongly encourage you to look into this direct pay, familiarize yourself with it. And as I mentioned, one of the previous ERI webinars, I believe addresses direct pay and is very well worth your time if you can go and dig that up and see it. Next slide. Okay, so it's been a crazy 18 months, starting when the IRA passed in August 2022. We're through much of the planning and applications. and by we, I mean, everybody involved in all of this. We're about to potentially learn about NCIF and CCIA awards, and then the fun really starts. There's going to be a very quick turnaround to try to get this money out the door. So keep your ear to the ground and really try to pay attention to some of these awards as they're made. This is a once in a generation opportunity. We all have to be ready for it, and when it happens, we have to move fast because the funding is actually going to start to flow as early as this summer. Next slide, please. So 2024 will include the launch of IEIF's residential and commercial financing programs, an expansion of its efforts to build a pipeline of other projects to leverage CCIA funding. Planning will kick off once awards of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund competitions are announced. Again, this may be as early as next week, so pay attention. The Office of Energy Development and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management will advance their respective plans to layer onto all of this other activity, what they're working on. And so, as I said, it's going to be quite a year. Buckle up for that. And it should be very interesting. And if you go to the next slide. Wanted to reiterate my thanks to many different parties, including ERI for hosting, all of you for hanging in there for this presentation, and also to really thank the many supporters IEIF has, some of whom are listed here. You have the McKinney Family Foundation, I mentioned them before. You have the McKnight Foundation, the City of Indianapolis Office of Sustainability, Builders Initiative, and in fact, we just learned the other day of a new funding partner, which is not yet listed here, but will be included, and really wanted to thank all of those groups and entities and all of you for all the work that's being done here. Go to the next slide. Here is my contact information again. As I said earlier, don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions, any project ideas. As I said, even if it's just the beginning of forming an idea or of a project, don't feel like you have to have it all buttoned up by the time you reach out. And I can bring in other resources to fill in some of the gaps if you need help on any project development. So why don't we pause here and see if there are any questions, Genevieve? And I'm happy to answer as many of them as I can.
Perfect. Alex, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Even I feel like I learned so much, and I'm sure that our audience learned a lot from you as well. So thank you again. So one question that we have in the chat is, what is the plan for the creation of the Onboard's Trade Alley network? And if you have any details on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's going to be a lot of work, and the plan is going to break down as follows. We, just the sheer volume of contractors and installers out there. We are going to, I think, start initially with certain geographies of the state, but we're going to open it up statewide from the get-go. But we're going to be concentrating our efforts. So we need as much input from people out there as we possibly can get. In terms of who are the contractors and installers that are going to be likely interested in joining the Trade Ally Network. So we're going to be, as I said, starting with certain geographies. I think it's going to start with Indianapolis, Fort Wayne, and the northern part of the state, just because we're going to be on the ground presenting to contractors. We can't do that to the whole state from the get-go. Having said that, we're going to have presentations. We're going to have documentation that we can send around. We're going to be reaching out throughout the state over time, and the process will be that once we have found a contractor somewhere that is interested in joining, they are going to apply to be onboarded, and the vetting will include us making sure that they're licensed where applicable, the insurance, check Better Business Bureau. So it's going to be it's a subset of the total contractor pool, and then they will be formally onboarded onto the platform, and that will allow them to be able to promote and access the financing. They will also have to be trained on the details of the financing that's available. So there's going to be that amount of effort to bring them on board.
Excellent, thank you. And then the next question is actually a clarifying question from a previous slide. Let me see if I can find it. Well, so it's about slide 22, which is about the buckets of the different buckets. Oh, yeah, here we go. The buckets of funding. And just clarifying, do communities need to have used the first bucket to take advantage of subsequent buckets?
That was my
Yep.
question. And
Oh.
it's actually I think maybe one more slide forward. It's the two, nope, maybe one more. And then one more. I'm sorry. Yes, that's it. Wondering if in order to take advantage of the competitive implementation grant, do you need to have taken advantage of the non-competitive planning grants?
My understanding is yes, and that surprisingly, even though it was non-competitive, certain states had not had not applied for the first, and they effectively, I think, lost the opportunity to do the second. I think that the way some of this was dealt with, and Indiana, by to their credit, did do the first. They and are now eligible for the second. But in states that decided to forego that, I think there are other entities that might be pursuing it on their behalf.
Thank you.
Okay.
And next question. So we have someone writes that Indiana Solar for All is a nonprofit project of the 501c3 Center for Sustainable Living that since 2018 has installed 44 energy systems on homes with household incomes typically under 50% of AMI in Monroe County and the counties that surround it. So far, we have been funded by donations, grants, and the Solarize program run by Siren with the help of the city of Bloomington. But our funding has dramatically dropped off since net metering was phased out by the Indiana legislature that ended in 2022. How might the IEIF help fund our low income solar program?
Yeah, so it's kind of hilarious at some level that a local program that had Solar for All as its name, that name was adopted. It's also a little confusing. Was adopted by a massive federal program. So kudos to Siren, kudos to Solar for All local, the local version, and there's a Solar for All statewide initiative as well. The name here is just unfortunately just confusing. The nice thing about Solar for All, the national program, what I was talking about before, is that it is exclusively focused on low income residential solar. So it kind of overlaps very well with the mission of the local Solar for All program, in that the two are really directed to try to take solar that has been, frankly, limited to some degree to higher income people, just by the nature of the cost structures and all that. And it takes some of that mission and really kind of like throws a lot of money at it. So the nice thing is that Solar for All, the federal program, can come in, and as I think I said in the presentation, that unlike some of the other programs that may be limited to financing, in the case of Solar for All, the funding can be used for grants as well. Certainly financing if there's a role for that, but it's much more it's much better tailored to the needs of low income populations, especially given sometimes the costs involved with solar. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question we have is, and you touched on this briefly, but can IEIF money be used for grant matching?
For grant matching, I think it sometimes that will come down to that will come down to the requirements of the grants. So it's kind of hard to answer that, I think, because grants sometimes have very different rules when it comes to the type of matches that they can count.
Thanks. Next up is, are there plans to ramp up the required workforce needed to deploy the volume of SFA, which I think is solar fall?
Yeah. I was sort of out of curiosity, I decided to do a study of the statewide network of solar installers. So Solar for All is all about solar installation. And I was just kind of thinking, just curious, and I hate to say this, but it didn't take me that long to do. There are a fair amount of players in Indiana. But I think given, if you just take the scale that we're talking about here and the volumes that we're talking about, um, on top of the existing demand that's out there, it will, I think, quickly overwhelm our workforce when it comes to solar installation. That's also true of the workforce associated with energy efficiency. And so not only do we need to expand the workforce, and that's really the intent of some of this federal programming, which is to really build up the workforce. I mentioned that there were some workforce development dollars in certain cases specifically designed for that. But in Indiana in particular, by virtue of, somewhat lackluster or, relatively speaking, advancements in this field, we have some work to do on the workforce development. We have some opportunities on the workforce development. And as I said, we have some particular opportunities on the portions of the workforce who are being under capitalized right now, under leveraged. And we just have to, just get people trained up on things like heat pumps, right? And really raise our game. So not only is there going to be a little bit of a choke point when it comes to some of the money flowing into the solar, but I think that that's true generally to really all parts of the clean energy transition that we have in Indiana.
Thank you for that insight. The next question we have is, are there any costs to the trade groups, like software costs? If not, what are the barriers or reasons a trade group would not want to participate, barring not working on applicable clean energy / energy efficiency products?
So there are going to be costs to using the financing. There's going to be a kind of, if you will, an origination cost that will be charged to the contractor, right? So and that's important because they need to have skin in the game. They need to, but it also is important because it needs to, it needs to perpetuate this. I mentioned that we don't want to be one and done on this funding. We need to create a sustainable model, and that's one way to do that, to create some sustainability. We are a nonprofit, so we're not out there trying to, make a profit on this thing. So there's that. But to the broader question of why would someone either want to be or not want to be part of this, let me start with, maybe what some of the hesitation would be. One is inertia. Something new is hard to take on. In some cases, they have existing jobs software, right? And so trying to figure out how to navigate between multiple software products, be trained on multiple software products, that could be complicated. Another one is that they have existing financing. Now, if you look at some of that financing, it's pretty harsh, right? It's not great for the not great for the end user necessarily in some cases, and in particular as interest rates have gone up, and the contractors themselves have a certain cost associated with that. So but the fact that they have existing financing means that potentially they're less interested in displacing that for something new. We're not suggesting that they need to stop with their other solutions. What we're saying is that we're an additional solution. We're a solution very specifically tailored to a certain type of work that they do. And one of the reasons they might be interested in doing it is, number one, there's this. I talked to an installer, a solar installer, actually not too long ago, who said, that one of the problems in today's world is if you are a kind of a smaller scale player, in fact, anybody, I think, the platform, you know, when you refer someone to a financing solution, you lose total visibility after you've made that reference. So you say to, you know, that I use Mrs. whatever Smith in the example, you know, let's say I'm the installer. I say, hey, Mrs. Smith, you know, you should go use credit union XYZ to go get your financing. Whether Mrs. Smith goes and does that, or where she is in the process, or, you know, how long is it going to take? That means that the job is languishing in my sales cycle, and I have no visibility into that. Whereas on the platform, both the contractor and the lender will know exactly where things stand. Plus, the approval process is almost in real time. So both of those are reasons why a contractor would be interested in doing this. And the financing is only for energy efficiency projects, which are sometimes, you know, more expensive than energy inefficient projects, right? So if you're replacing a device with one or the other, it's actually a big, you know, a little bit more expensive to do energy efficient projects. So that's actually good for the contractor. They should be interested in that because they're in fact going to have you know, a better job.
Thank you. And also, I just wanted to note that I did just put 2 links in the chat towards the end. The first of which is the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub intake form. So this is, if you're interested in connecting with us, please use that link. And then also I have a link to the public ERI newsletter. So both of these will be good ways to keep in touch. And I think we have time for one more question. The last one that was posted in the chat. And this is there any credit criteria for the trade group to participate? And how much is the trade group fee?
We are actually working through that right now. In terms of the fee, we're trying to you know, I mentioned that we're trying to bring in we are bringing in a national partner. So we're actually doing the final negotiations on that. I think I'm gonna have to defer on that question, both of those questions actually, until we can get some finalization of that. I have some idea of it. What I can say is the fee and onboarding process. The onboarding process, you know, we want to make sure that we're bringing on someone who's going to provide a quality service. We don't want to have people on the platform that are not able to, you know, that are not good recommendations to end users. We are going to be probably very close to the model that's being implemented in other green banks, in Michigan in particular, for example. That is, they have 900 contractors on their platform. So the fees are not at all a showstopper. In fact, I think the contractors are pleased to be on that platform. So yes, there'll be some fees. It's not going to be something that is so burdensome that, you know, it would be silly, because then we would effectively not be able to have trade outlets, right?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. We are basically at time, so I appreciate Alex, you participating in this webinar with us. Our audience members, thank you so much for joining us. And this, once we will publish this recording, where and you can share it with your networks and relook at our resources. So thank you, everyone, again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.